All right, so when we're looking at the unit 4, the political geography unit, we are looking at it through the lens of a geographer, the spatial perspective, the why of where. That's always the question that you want to ask when you study any of these units. So what we're looking at here is the spatial context regarding politics. And when we talk about politics, we're looking at governments or government systems, anything having to do with government. Kind of a look back at what we were looking at in Unit 1 last week. I wanted to show you, this is a political map. I'm not sure if I had actual political map on my previous slide, because I knew I was going to get to it here. But let's see, the political maps, what they do is they show countries. They show political units. You can see the different governments are divided by lines and different colors that represent them. Make it pretty easy to see where one country stops and one country starts. They do not show physical features. For that, you would need a physical map. Now, this map doesn't show state boundaries. So political maps show state boundaries. Physical maps show just the different kinds of topography. You can look at elevations, like you can tell where the mountains are, you can tell where the water is, you can tell where the deserts and the forests and all that kind of stuff are. Usually, though, elevation, or different types of topographic features is the main thing you're going to see on a physical map. So right here, you see the country of Turkey. All right, and everybody knows, hey, that's Turkey, the most secular of all the Muslim countries in the Middle East. But if you look over here, is that showing you Turkey, or is it showing you something else? Well, you could say this is the landform where the country of Turkey resides. This is where it is. But what it is Anatolia. So right here, you see the political unit known as Turkey. Right here, you see the Anatolian Peninsula. Notice it's covered by water on 3 sides. You do have this strait. You got Istanbul here. And so it is actually, they might, Caitlin, I would imagine they do. I mean, who doesn't eat turkey, right? But no kidding, that's the Anatolian Peninsula. So keep in mind that the physical geographic characteristics, the physical geography is not necessarily the same thing as the political units. That's the reason why I'm going over this with you right now. Other examples include this is Italy, right? This is the Italian Peninsula, and so on. There's tons of different examples of that. Now, geographic names like Anatolia are associated with site factors or situation factors. So we think about Anatolia, we automatically think about the crossroads of the old world, right? We think about the edge of the Mediterranean, the place where Europe, Asia, and Africa all come together. And that's kind of what we think about when we think about the physical geography. Let's pretend we're looking at the Andes Mountains. We think about the western side of the American or South American continent. You think about, I think about the country of Chile. All right, so you think about things in terms of site and situation when you're looking at physical geography. When you're looking at the political geography, you always think in terms of governments, or at least that's what I would challenge you guys to do. So Turkey, secular Muslim country, conflict with ethnic groups like the Kurds. That's in the news all the time. Allied to the U.S. Questions about authoritarianism recently, as their president would use what we would consider maybe pretty extreme measures to take care of people he would deem as criminals. This right here is strictly terminology, right? We always want to make sure we know the terminology, so then we can answer questions regarding the application thereof. So states, nations, nation states, what in the world is all this stuff? I would definitely think about using like maybe Quizlet or something like that to learn this vocab. You can go and find this stuff all over the place, right? A state, simply put, and these are really condensed definitions, but it is a political unit with set territory, people, and sovereignty. Now, the 3 characteristics of a state: people. You can't have a state if you don't have people to govern. You can't have a state if you don't have boundaries that, hey, this is where our state starts and this is where it stops. And you need to have sovereignty. Now, that word sovereignty means that the government has complete power to control what happens within those boundaries and regarding those people. Now, that right there is a tricky question. I guess defining sovereignty gets kind of tricky because there are different ways to interpret what that is. We're probably not going to get too deep into that, but just know that sovereignty is a government's power to control what happens within those boundaries. Now, a nation is a group of people bound by ethnicity, language, culture, heritage, history, and don't forget this, territory. Because usually when you think about a nation, it comes in conjunction with people who want to have their ability to govern themselves within the territory where they live. A perfect example of this is the Palestinians. So right now you hear about the president of Israel, Netanyahu, is wanting to name parts of the Golan Heights after President Trump, because President Trump recognizes that as Jewish territory. And so you've got the Palestinians who want their own state to be recognized in the territory where they live within the state of Israel. Perfect example of what nations go through here. A nation state is a scenario where it's a combination of the definition of a state and a nation. So if you think about the French, they are a nation state because, and again, this is, people are going to debate that, right? There are some people who are going to say, well, there's a ton of different national groups within France that could cause it to be a multi-ethnic or a multinational group. For the most part, the French speak French. They have a history of Roman Catholicism. They have a similar culture. It's the country of the Enlightenment, right? The arts, the fashion, all this kind of stuff, the association with Paris. These are different things that bind these people in France together as a nation. So usually you think about places like in Europe, for example, a lot of them are going to be what I would consider nation states. And I wouldn't think about, there are some teachers that are going to say, well, it's got to be 95% homogeneity. I think I'm going to say, as long as you can explain why it's a nation state, and you're looking at a statement that has mostly homogeneous population, then you're going to hit the mark pretty good. Okay, Denmark, Italy. These are all examples of nation states in Europe. Okay, and finally, a multinational state is going to be one like Russia. There's a bunch of different national groups within the boundaries of the state, and sometimes this can cause some problems. We're going to talk about a big problem with a multinational state when we get to Yugoslavia. All right, let's take a look real quick at the questions. Take a look at the questions. How many different types of farming are there, and where are they used in the world? Promise, we're going to get to that. Hopefully, we're going to get to that today. But that's definitely one thing that we're going to want to use. I definitely did cover this in one of my previous videos on I think it was the origins of agriculture, but it's one of the 4 that I did on that. So you can take a look at that. But we're going to look at that when we get to it in this presentation. How has the country moved from stage 2 to stage 3 in the epidemiologic transition model? Is that what you're referring to there? This is one of those things I'm going to talk about in the bonus slides. But in short, the difference between the demographic transition model and the epidemiological transition model is that you look at how different types of epidemics begin to affect and I guess begin to affect the population based on how long they live. And so from stage 2 to 3, honestly, a lot of that, I would say in a way it's a continuation of it. So you might start seeing, as you move into stage 3, different types of degenerative diseases like maybe heart disease or different types of diseases associated with longer life that people wouldn't get if they died at a very young age. In stage 2, I would say that the main thing you're looking at is different types of sicknesses that are associated with the Industrial Revolution, like the big one being cholera. Okay, and then again, as you go on, you start seeing things like cancers and things like lung disease, or things that are caused by people who basically have enough money to spend on things like cigarettes that kill you. And then in a stage 5, you start to kind of see the reemergence of some of these old diseases that you wouldn't think we'd be dealing with right now. The big one being smallpox, because people won't get vaccinated, or another one being something like Ebola that you're like, what the heck is that, and where did it come from? Crazy stuff. Hopefully you'll join me on Sunday and we'll look at that in more detail. What is the difference between a relic boundary and an antecedent boundary? We're going to look at that in just a moment. But relic boundary, the easiest way to remember this is that a relic boundary is going to be one that no longer really serves a purpose. Like, for example, you can look at the Great Wall of China, but it's a tourist attraction today. It's not going to keep people back and forth because that's not even the purpose it serves anymore. But back in the day, it used to be something that would keep the Mongols or the Manchus, whoever it is, out of China. Another example of a relic boundary would be Hadrian's Wall. We're going to get that in a moment, so just hang tight on that question. Is there going to be a cahoot? There's not going to be a cahoot today, no. That said, there are tons of different types of cahoots and Quizlets out there you guys can find that could be really beneficial if you use it right. Let's see, where is subsistence? Actually, you know what, let's take a break. I'll look at that in a second as we get closer to that. Okay, so defining nationality. Nationality is going to be defined differently depending on who you are, all right? So there's no straight way to define it, but in essence, we're going to look at the United Kingdom as an explanation for how you define nationality. It has to do with how people identify themselves, okay? So there's two things you can learn when you're studying sociology. People are going to identify themselves as something, and then people other than you might identify you or identify a group of people based on what they see. So identifying against. In this case, we're going to keep it simple and look at the United Kingdom. So we know that everything that's colored here, everything that is either blue, orange, white, or red is part of what we call the United Kingdom, okay? Everything that's gray, that's Ireland. That's the Republic of Ireland. It's not the same country at all. So the different colors represent the nations that associate with the territory where they live. And it gets kind of, people really identify strongly with the nationality in the United Kingdom. They're probably more likely to say, I'm English or Welsh or Scottish, for example, before they're going to say, I'm from the United Kingdom or wherever it might be. I can't speak for everyone, but I'm just saying that the different types of nationalities are it's a little bit more, I guess, intense than what we would think when we look at things like states or even sports affiliations and things like that. Is kind of similar, but this is a little bit more intense. For example, when these guys are playing soccer, they play as separate teams based on their nationality, and they are intense rivals between the different groups. All right, so they also don't all agree politically on certain things. So Brexit has been in the news a lot lately, and there's been a lot of things that kind of overshadowed it. But this vote happened years ago, and they're still trying to figure out exactly what the terms are by which they're going to leave the European Union. Now, if you look at this, notice that the majority of people in Scotland, the majority of people in Northern Ireland, and a lot of people in Wales over here decided that they wanted to remain, according to the color scheme here, they wanted to remain in the European Union. Mainly people in England, especially in the central and northern parts of England, wanted to leave. And so you can see right here some of the differences between the nationalities on the basis of their political ideology, or at least their opinions of the European Union. Moving on, the nation-state concept, I want you to know, and this is in the course description, nation-state concept is a very European concept. All right, so we might think, and I think we do, kind of consider every state to be a nation. We'll hear on the news where they talk about, the United States as a nation, and they talk about different nations within Europe or nations in Asia or whatever it might be. That word is used synonymously with country. Well, by definition, the word state is synonymous to country. So when we talk about the United States, we're really looking more at like what most of the world is going to call a province or a territory within a state, right? But this nation-state concept is European, and it kind of begins as Europe moves out, as a transition out of the era of feudalism in the High Middle Ages. So what starts to happen, I don't know if you guys have studied feudalism and world history and all that, but people basically served a lord, and the feudal contract was centered on this lord has an army, and he's going to protect you from bandits and other people that want to kill you. In return, you do a bunch of work and live your life on a certain piece of territory owned by this guy. And if there's ever war, they're going to call in the lesser nobility and their armies, and they're going to fight against their enemies. Okay, but eventually, about the time the 100 Years' War ended, and then definitely by the Renaissance and going into the period of Enlightenment, and then kind of culminating with the end of the 30 Years' War, people started to speak the same language on a regional basis. They started to serve the same king, not feudal lord, and they started to have rivalries on the basis of who they are, centered on these characteristics that bound them together within their territory. So you start to see the formation of different nations in Europe about, all throughout this time period, but definitely kind of culminating with the Peace of Westphalia. Now, this is an important end to a war, because during this time they start to recognize sovereignty on the basis of this government exists here, so they're going to be sovereign. Now, that might be a little bit too general, but essentially, when you think about sovereignty, just again, not going too deep, but a country like the United States, we have power to do whatever we want to within our country, its boundaries. Let's pretend for a second that Canada didn't like what we did. Can they make us stop? Can they stop us from doing what we want to do? They literally can't. Okay, North Korea literally can't stop us from doing what we want to do in our country. But if you look at a country like Syria, who's been in a civil war since 2011, you guys surely have heard about the Syrian migration, the Syrian crisis, and all this. That country, you could argue, doesn't have the same kind of sovereignty as a country like the United States, because in fact, that is a proxy war between Russia and Iran, pretty much, and the United States and everyone else, Saudi Arabia and everyone, who's kind of fighting over who gets to influence the future of that country. So with that said, the Peace of Westphalia kind of established sovereignty as the idea that if a government exists, or if a group of people exist here, we want to keep them around for a little bit. Another part of this is they want to preserve what we call balance of power, but we'll save that for world history. Nationalism, strong pride, fervor, togetherness, and a cause on the basis of all these national identities, okay, that we just taught, these characteristics we just talked about. So the key here is that when you look at nationalism, these people are together in their pride for who they are, and there is a spatial, I guess, context to this. Okay, so people are proud of who they are, but they're also proud of the territory in which they control. Colonialism and imperialism spread ideas of nationalism, but also kind of led to the oppression of different groups of nations within these places where the Europeans had expanded. So in a way, that oppression caused many of these individuals to come together in their similarities and fight for things like self-determination, which, when I say that, I mean they're fighting for their own autonomy or their own government. I just went over that. I guess I copied it in twice. All right, so let's talk about economy. Economy is going to be a territory controlled by a stronger government. It's going to be a direct control, more or less. They're going to come in and say, hey, we are the owners of this land, and we're going to exploit you guys for all of your resources or whatever it might be to fuel our industries back home. And so that's really what you're seeing with colonialism. Now, the other side of this is imperialism. I don't have it on this slide. It's going to be later on down the way. But imperialism is more of an economic control or an economic influence over a certain country. So they're not going to send people to live there and change things. They're going to send just maybe a few people there. They're going to use maybe local police or whatever it might be in order to exploit a group for their resources or whatever it might be. Okay, so there is a little bit of a difference here. You see a lot of colonialism. I'll go back in the age of exploration. You see India became England's greatest colonial possession. I mean, it was a true colony. But a lot of what you see in Africa, a lot of what you see in Asia, those were spheres of influence, or those were different kinds of examples of imperialism, not outright colonialism. And these are examples of the many colonies that maybe still exist today in some form or fashion. And notice they're very, very small. The overwhelming number of colonies in the world today are usually geographically very, very small regions. Nothing super big. Probably the biggest that I can think of would be Greenland, which is actually part of Denmark. And that's ironic because Denmark is a super small country right here in Europe. So colonialism, and imperialism has impacted modern political borders, and nowhere can this be seen more than in Africa. All right. So if you look here on the left-hand side, what you're looking at is the different ethnic or linguistic or sometimes ethno-linguistic borders between the different people groups that live in Africa. Now, each one of these different groups of people could be considered a nation. All right, so they have territory within these places where they live, and they kind of do whatever it is they gotta do to maintain their their nation. But over here, you're looking at a political map of Africa, and notice that there is a lot of it doesn't mesh well, does it? So if you look at just Nigeria, by the way, Nigeria is the most populous African country. It is going to be the third most populous country in the world by 2100, according to current population trends. And look at the diversity in Nigeria. That's a huge amount of diversity. You look at places like South Sudan. We're going to talk about that later on. Just a huge amount of diversity. No wonder they're in a crazy civil war that's been going on ever since the country became the world's newest country, by the way, in 2011. I would probably know that too. South Sudan is the world's newest country, happened in 2011. Let's take a break. I got some questions. I got a lot of them. All right. What is the city description in the multiple nuclei model? What is a city description? If you're asking for an example, I want to say, I hope I'm right in saying this. I believe that Chicago was the basis for each of the three different models, believe it or not. So depending on how you look at that, definitely for the concentric zone and the sector model, Chicago was the basis for that. But a lot of these you can apply to many different North American cities for sure. Now, if you start looking in Europe, you're going to start looking at other types of formations. But keep in mind that those models, all right, are to be applied mainly to North American cities. Okay. So I think that Chicago would probably be the best. But again, honestly, the overall it doesn't really it doesn't matter. You don't need to know examples as much as you need to know the spatial perspective in terms of the way that the cities are organized and the reasons for that. And that's the important thing that you're going to get if you look at my video that I put up there earlier. Is agricultural innovation absolutely necessary to advancement? Well, if you think about the fact that people used to be hunter-gatherers and then they used to use relatively primitive forms of agriculture that led to civilization and led to advancements and things like this, but you also were prone to flooding and things. If the Nile River or if the Tigris Euphrates didn't flood right, you'd have famines. So I would say we wouldn't be where we are if we had not figured out ways to innovate. And really, we need to do that again, because now it's not a matter of what can we produce as much as it's a matter of how can we produce it in a sustainable fashion. So we're trying to repeat, I guess, we're still trying to innovate the way we produce food. I hope I answered that question right. Where is subsistence agriculture mostly practiced? In a nutshell, if you look at a map that shows the entire world, all right, I don't know if I've got one here, and you look between the Tropic of Capricorn and Tropic of Cancer, everything in that little area, that's mainly your subsistence farming. Okay, so definitely, if you look here in Africa, the majority of people in sub-Saharan Africa, the majority of them are subsistence farmers. All right, they are basically the equivalent of what we would call peasants in most of these areas. So you still have predominantly subsistence farming going on here. You have a lot of subsistence farmers in Southeast Asia, maybe a few if you go a little bit further west, a little bit further inland within China. So we will look at that a little bit more in detail as we progress through these slides. For the political map, does it tell the types of governments, or does it just show the boundaries in the states and cities and stuff like that? It shows all those different things. Usually you aren't going to see what type of government though. So for example, if you see a map that shows North and South Korea, it's not going to say North Korea dictatorship or South Korea republic. So you would have to know a little bit about those countries in order to be able to make that deduction. But it definitely does show usually capitals, usually really influential economic cities. So you might not see a capital, but you might definitely see another city that has a lot of influence. For example, here you see Cairo, which is the capital of Egypt. All right, so over here you see the capital of Saudi Arabia, but you don't see Mecca and Medina. Okay, so you might not. It just depends on the map, honestly. Okay, why isn't Canada a nation state? Canada is not a nation state because Mainly, you look at Quebec, the people in Quebec known as the Quebecois. Let's see if it caught that. It did not. The Quebecois is how you pronounce that. They are a group of people that have French heritage. They speak French. They are culturally French. Their street signs are in French. So you go outside of Quebec, you've got people that more or less talk and act like us. So there have been referendums and things in Quebec to become their own country. So I mean, you may see that in your lifetime where that may happen. I would imagine that Canada wouldn't want that because that's a pretty well-to-do province with a large chunk of the population. But yeah, that's why. Another reason why is you've got the Iroquois Indians that live, or Native Americans live in the Saskatchewan and all that kind of stuff. All right, so there's many different national groups in Canada. For the political map, does it tell the types of governments, or do they just show? Could you share this presentation? This presentation is in the you should get it with a 500+ account. Let me ask that question because I'm not sure what they do with those presentations, but I know that if you have 500+, you should have access to it. Let's see. Jordan Miller says they usually have it connected to the replay, but has access through 500+. Yeah. So I honestly don't know how I'd have to check and see if there's another way to get it to you. And I'm going to do that and come back next week and we'll look at it. All right. But definitely with 500+, which right now is literally $5 a month. You got one more month, actually 2 weeks until the AP exam. I would say this is worth it rather than to wait another week. That's just me. For the political map, does it tell the types of governments, or do they show boundaries and stuff? I think I just answered that. But yes, it depends on who created the map. But usually they will show the government. Usually they will show the capital or other influential cities, and you might get more or less depending on who makes the map. Are you going to share this presentation with us? Yes. If you have 500+, you already have access to it. It would definitely be in the shared files, and so hopefully you guys have access to that. It should be pretty easy to do. AP Human Geography is in the Discord. I found out what that is, by the way. If somebody has that link, feel free to share it. Which resources do you recommend to study for the AP test aside from 500? Hey, that's a really good question. I think, one, you don't want to overload yourself, especially not right now, with just a tremendous load of study resources, because then you're going to be like, oh, where do I look? What do I do? And you're going to get overwhelmed, and you're not going to be productive in your studying. So if you've got like 10 books you're looking at, pick like your favorite 2 or 3 and go with that. One thing that at this point, assuming that you've already kind of been putting time into knowing and identifying where your weaknesses are, I would recommend getting something maybe like iScore 5, who is made by people who I actually know some of the creators of that app. Some of them have been on the committee that are, I guess, on the team, whatever you want to call them, that write some of the FRQs, and I've spoken with some of them. So I would recommend look at that if you want something aside from this as well. Look at some of the review manuals. At this point, I would recommend like maybe Princeton Review or Kaplan. Those are going to be about $20 if you can still find them, but they have not only practice tests, but they also have the key so you can see what the right answer is. And as much FRQ practice as you can possibly get. Go on to the College Board website and look up the released FRQs and practice writing them. And then practice writing them in groups. And then practice grading them in groups. These are the things I would certainly do if I were you. Let's see. What is one way an infectious disease can reemerge in stage 5 of the epidemiologic transition? Well, the 2 examples that I looked at, I think, kind of do a good job at demonstrating this. One, you've got something like Ebola. Okay, now Ebola is something that really, I think, you had it throughout the 1900s. I really didn't know what Ebola was until it hit the news, like in whenever it was, 3, 4, or 5 years ago. Right, but it's something that started like along a particular river. It might have been the Ebola River, somewhere in. I'm not going to know the country, but it was somewhere over this way. Eventually, it may have been African, Chad or Central African Republic. But anyway, eventually it got into airports in Nigeria, if I'm not mistaken. I hope I'm right about these countries. But the point is, from there it spread to all over the world, and people are like freaking out. They're like, "Wow, I don't even know what is this Ebola thing? And it kills you fast, and you got people getting quarantined, and you don't even know how to cure it. And so we had to scramble to find vaccinations and stuff for it. That's certainly one way that you can see infectious diseases or something like that and reemerge. Another thing that you kind of see if you look at maybe something like cholera. We don't think of cholera being a problem anymore in North America or Europe, but in places around, again, sub-Saharan Africa that are industrializing quick. If you look at Nigeria's capital, the population there, as we discussed last week, is incredibly is growing faster than any other city in the world, and with that is going to come huge amounts of sanitation problems, and so you have a lot of just stagnant, nasty water, and you got kids thrashing around and drinking it. Oops, I dropped my mic. Sorry about that. And so what happens is you start to see the reemergence of diseases like cholera in some of these industrializing, what would be considered stage 2 countries. And then if you look at the measles outbreak right now, I mean, who'd have thought that we'd see such ridiculously stupid high levels of measles outbreaks? But then you got people that say, hey, I'm not going to get my kids vaccinated, and next thing you know, what do you expect? Of course, we're going to start to see measles come around again. And so God only knows what's going to happen with that. Good luck going to see the Avengers. You might get measles. Which resources? I just answered this question. I'm not sure why it didn't do. But yeah, resources, definitely listen to that. Why are maquiladoras so important in the United States? It has to do with, we're going to look at, there's a video I did on supranational organizations, but NAFTA is a trade agreement between the United States, Canada, Mexico. And what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to make a trade between those 3 countries as beneficial to all 3 as it possibly can be. And one of the things that this means is that you're going to have labor being moved to Mexico where it's cheaper, but you wanted to have it so that people were able to buy the goods being produced in that in those factories in the other countries without having to pay the tariffs. And so as long as the I guess the revenue from those maquiladoras benefit the country where they're from, they're able to do it tariff free. And so you have these factories that are going to grow along the border of the Mexico and the United States for that purpose as a result of NAFTA. Let me find that question again. Well, it disappeared from me. All right, so check it out. I'm going to take a break from the countries, from the questions. We're going to go back and look some more at the slides. But great questions. I know I've got 19. I hope I can get to them all. We still got a lot of time tonight, so let's see how we get. I feel like I'm going faster this time than I did last time. So maybe we'll get there. All right, so what we're looking at here is we looked at colonialism and imperialism and the impact they have on modern countries today. Africa is the biggest example. You look at places like North Korea and South Korea, you can kind of see an example right there as well. Korea, period, was a territory owned by China, owned by Japan, and after World War II, it starts coming under the influence of communism and democracy and capitalism and all that. And so you start to see where it was one of the proxy wars that are part of the bigger Cold War period, which again resulted in the political differences between North Korea and South Korea. Now, one thing that I want you guys to know is that this is one nation of people. This is one nation. This is a multi-state nation. One of the few, if not the only one I can think of off the top of my head, is a multi-state nation. Both of these states, they're different political units, have the same nation of people living within them. But the difference isn't their nationality, it isn't their language or their culture. The difference is the government in which they live. So that's the key here. That's the reason why I put that there. Somebody asked about this earlier in the presentation. Here's our breakdown of the different types of borders. And so I glossed through it pretty quick then because I knew I was going to look here and go through it in more detail. But you've got different classifications of boundaries. There may be a few others that aren't listed here, but I mean, more or less, you want to know these things. Maybe if you'd be able to think of a few examples of them. So let's break it down. Antecedent boundaries. I also did a video on boundaries, by the way. I forgot about that. Antecedent boundaries draw before the were drawn before the area was populated. Okay, one example of this, and probably the best example of this, would be Canada and the United States. You got this massive border, one of the longest borders in the world between the two countries. And what happened was most people, when they first started to settle on that land, they lived on the eastern side. And as time went on, they expanded further west. And you guys heard about Manifest Destiny in 8th grade or whenever it is you study your U.S. history in middle school, whatever it might be. And so they moved further west over time. And as they did, they just kept that same latitude line for the border between the two. A historic example of an antecedent boundary would be the Treaty of Tordesillas. So during the Age of Exploration, you've got Portugal, and Spain. And Portugal finds a way around Africa in order to get to the riches in Asia, and it just totally makes the Spanish super jealous. And so they're so crazy and so like ready to get the Portuguese back and get in on all that trade that they like take this Italian dude and they're like, Christopher Columbus, we'll pay you. We'll go ahead and sponsor you to go across the Atlantic Ocean, even that's kind of the crazy talking. And when he did, he found obviously South America. And really the Americas. And nobody knew how big the Americas were. And that's the reason why this is an example of an antecedent boundary. Because the Portuguese are like, holy mess, they're in Asia. See, everybody thought that they went around the world. They thought that they had gone and found Asia by going across the Atlantic. So the Portuguese are like afraid that the Spanish are going to try to claim their territory. And so they get the Pope involved. Now the Pope's involved, and they're going to draw a line right down, basically a line of longitude in which they're going to just say everything on the western side of this line is going to belong to the Spanish. And everything on the eastern side of this line is going to belong to the Portuguese. Now, obviously, they couldn't police that. And other countries start getting in on the action, and it didn't really amount to much, but it was an example of a historic antecedent boundary. Subsequent boundaries created after people have lived there. So this is usually to like divide different people on the basis of ethnic and religious and linguistic characteristics. You see some of that in, I would say, Europe. I would say Yugoslavia might be an example of that. But that's what you're looking at with your subsequent boundaries. So a relic boundary, we already discussed, no longer a real border. It's more of a tourist attraction, but it's a relic of the past. So something that used to be real, now it has a real historical and spatial significance, but usually it doesn't really do anything anymore. And then finally, a superimposed boundary is going to be something that's placed on a group of people by another group of people that basically have sovereignty on there. And a perfect example of this is the borders between the African countries that we've already talked about. And that happened as a result of the Berlin Conference, where Africa was divided up by Europeans, and African leaders were not even invited to the dividing up party. So that was kind of a big deal. But this is a perfect example of a superimposed boundary. All right, so I wanted to show you guys this because supranationalism was discussed on January the 10th. I think the reason why I'm showing you that is because I don't. Oh, okay, here it's shapes of states. I wanted to show you this because of the shapes of states. So I'm not going to get into state morphology here. Honestly, if you guys use the Rubenstein Cultural Landscape book, they do the best job at showing the different shapes of states. I would expect you guys to be able to identify a few of them, but and this is in the course articulation, but it's really simple stuff to learn and to remember. So I'm gonna leave that for now, and if we have some time at the end, I will maybe go back and we'll review some of that stuff. Super easy, so I'm not going to get into that right now, but just know that if you go back in the earlier reviews, if you want to see state morphology, which is what you call shapes of states, feel free to do that. All right, so boundaries. Looking at boundaries a little bit more. They're basically invisible lines that mark the extent of a state's territory today. They used to be that you could use physical features to, I guess, denote where one place is and another place is gonna be. So mountains used to be natural barriers between different groups of people. Bodies of water, rivers, deserts, any of these things would be easy landmarks that you could use in order to, I guess, determine what is going to be the boundary between places. But today, usually they are, they're measured by lines of latitude, and you can't see them on the ground. I know that where I live in South Carolina, if you go to Carowinds, which is kind of around Winthrop University, over there, near Charlotte. It's right. It's on the border between North Carolina and South Carolina. There's a point where you can stand on the border between the two states, and you can't see it other than the fact that they put it on the concrete. So it's cool, when you're a kid and you stand in the two states. But that's the point I'm trying to make, is that today a lot of the boundaries that we see on maps don't have any kind of special features that separate them. They're simply going to be lines on the ground, imaginary lines. You wouldn't even see if you didn't know it. All right. Oh goodness. Let me see what Shane writes here. Oh, it disappeared. I don't have time to go back and look at it. Anyway, South Carolina, man, nothing like home. Did we talk about sense of place a few weeks ago? All right. So anyway, types of boundaries, physical and cultural. We just mentioned a bunch of the physical boundaries. They're pretty self-explanatory, right? Deserts, mountains, and water. They also are good natural defense mechanisms. Cultural boundaries are perhaps a little bit more complicated. So usually they're going to be represented by geometric boundaries. Geometric boundaries, again, being the using latitude and longitude to determine where your country is going to end and another country begins. A lot of times they separate different linguistic or religious or cultural groups in the process. Religious boundaries, again, if you look at Europe during the Reformation, you got some people in Germany will have been Protestant. Some people in the southern and the western states in Europe would have been predominantly Catholic. And so you could see the religious boundaries if you look at maps during the Reformation period. Ethnic boundaries, we're going to look at some examples of those. As a term that you might want to know, frontier is simply going to be an area where there's going to be no real complete political authority. And it's not because it's not within the territories of a government, or it's not because the government has no sovereignty. It's simply because the terrain is so crazy that no one's going to be there to police what happens. Good examples of this might be if you look at the Arabian Peninsula and you're looking at the territory between Yemen, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. It's desert. No one's going to be there. They're not going to see if you're crossing the border and stuff. That said, you got to be careful of that stuff because, it wasn't too long ago you didn't hear about someone who had crossed over the border between like Iraq and Iran and got straight up arrested and stuff and were considered to be spies and all that crap. So, it does happen, but that's what you look at with frontiers. It used to be that, like, back during, for example, the Roman Empire, the frontier will have been the extent at which the country was able to defend. So you knew you were in a frontier whenever the soldiers couldn't protect the boundaries from the barbarians to the north or whatnot. So that really is what you're looking at with the frontier. All right. A microstate, another term we need to look at, and another thing that has important spatial context here. A microstate or a mini-state, I would know the term microstate, is going to be a sovereign state having a very small population and very low land area. Now, don't be fooled by this very small population tidbit, because remember, last week we looked at population density, okay? And we saw that the 7 most densely populated countries on Earth are microstates. The most densely populated country on Earth that's not a microstate is Bangladesh. All right. So even though they might not have super large populations, they are extremely tightly packed within the cities that the government resides. And also keep in mind that they are sovereign nations. They answer to a government leader, and they have power to control what happens within their borders. But they couldn't ward off an invasion from the United States if we wanted to go in there and take them over. So again, they might have sovereignty, but they don't have unlimited power to defend their borders. So here's a map that shows many of them. The ones I would probably be most familiar with if I were you would probably be some of these here in Europe. Vatican City is an enclave as well. It's going to be completely surrounded by the state of Italy. San Marino is another one that's completely surrounded by Italy. Okay. Andorra, Monaco, Luxembourg. Luxembourg's a little bit bigger than other microstates, but I guess would still count as one. Then you go over here and you see some of these other ones over here. Singapore is one we talked about. Did anybody have a teacher that would show you the National Night video when talking about pro-natalist policies. Anybody watch Nationality? Anyway, I used to show that to my students. I'm surprised I wasn't fired. Nation states and multinational states. We looked at this a little bit earlier, so I'm going to kind of blast through it pretty quick. But again, a multi-ethnic state like the United States is going to have many different ethnic groups living within the boundaries of the state, but they're not looking for establishing their own government within that territory. So some people do consider the United States to be a the name of the video is National Night. It's a song about making babies. It's pretty hilarious. But anyway, nation states are I'm sorry, the United States is going to be a multi-ethnic group because they only have people that are trying to establish their own country within. Some people might argue that the United States is even a nation on the basis of the fact that we kind of are a melting pot, and we believe very strongly about our freedoms of expression and our freedoms of religion and all these different things that are protected by our Constitution. So you could say that that's the fiber that binds us all together as Americans. And in that regard, some people do consider us to be a nation. But a multinational state like Russia is going to be one that has all these different national groups, all right? All these different national groups that reside within the state boundaries. And some of them, especially these along the border, they don't want to be part of Russia. They want to be part of their own country. They want self-determination. So they want to be their own country. So Russia is the best example of a multinational state. They have the most nationalities, among which many of them want to be their own country. Now, it doesn't seem very doesn't seem very connected to what we looked at so far, but it is when you think about the different types of boundaries. And so today in the world of globalization, one of the things that you really want to be aware of, okay, is the fact that the countries want to control the territory on the outside of their actual land borders as well. And so if they have access to the ocean, there's a lot of different resources and things they can tap into, and they want to be able to tap into those things. And so you've got the law of the sea. The United Nations gets together. You got this agreement on these different laws that everyone kind of internationally are supposed to abide by. All right, no matter where you are. And in essence, I mean, this is just a kind of a simplistic version of this. And I don't think you need to know like a collegiate level understanding of this law. But the way it works is that up to 12 nautical miles, a country has complete sovereignty, more or less, in that territory. It's like considered territory of the state. All right. But once you start to exceed that, you go into what they call the contiguous zone, up to 24 nautical miles, in which case they are able to, I think I've got another graphic here. Nope, I don't. They're able to control a lot of the economics that happens, but they lose a lot of the complete sovereignty control that they will have had under the territorial sea. Once you exceed the 24 nautical miles, you have up until 200 nautical miles that you have this is considered exclusive economic zone. So you have the ability to I hope I'm right in saying this, regulate to some degree the kinds of economics that goes on in that area. Like you can use that as your fishing area or whatnot. You can maybe stop other countries from using that for their fishing areas, and you can kind of control what happens there in that area between the 24 and the 200 nautical miles. After that, you're in what we call the high seas. Okay, and this is just a free for all. You can't stop anyone from going in the high seas. Okay. Nobody has sovereignty there, which is the reason why I included this map right after that, because you look at the South China Sea, right, and then you apply what we just looked at with this law of the sea and the South China Sea, and all these different countries, Vietnam, Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, all of these different countries, Korea, China, Japan, they all want to have access to not Japan. They all want to have access to their, what they would consider their territorial and contiguous and exclusive economic zone. But the Chinese are like, hey guys, we're gonna draw this big line around the whole entire thing and say it's all ours. Why? Because we're strong enough and because we have a historical legacy of controlling this entire area, right? And so none of you guys can have any of this land. It's ours. And to prove it, we're going to go in here, we're going to start building islands and stuff, and have building airstrips and different types of military bases in these islands we're putting up in the South China Sea. And it kind of turned a lot of heads towards the end of the Obama presidency. And it was part of the reason for Obama's shift or pivot, as he called it, to Asia. It's because China was doing all this, and a huge, maybe even I wouldn't say that, but there's a huge amount of goods going into the United States and also going into this territory flows through the South China Sea. So the United States does have a lot to lose if China starts getting pretty crazy about the way they exert their influence over this area. But it's a really good modern day example of the law of the sea in action. Okay, so let's see. I mentioned ASEAN here, okay, which I'm not sure if I said that right or not. That's how I say it. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations is a supranational organization. I covered this and other supranational organizations in one of my earlier favorable reviews on supranationalism. So I'm not going to spend too much time going through all of them, but I would recommend that definitely if you're a 5 plus or if you're going to be, go back and look at that and just kind of get an idea in your head of the gist of those supranational organizations. And remember, always the focus is going to be on the why of where, the spatial perspective, not so much on memorizing which countries are a part of what and knowing every single one of them and all the different things. You just want to have kind of a general idea of what brought them together and why it's important from a spatial context, as always. Now, moving on, we're about halfway through with tonight's review. And I feel like I'm kind of getting close to the end of my review on political geography, which means we're going to be able to start moving into agriculture. I want to take a quick look because we're about to start looking at gerrymandering. I want to take a quick look at our comments or our questions. I'm going to take a quick swig of tea. All right. Let's take a look. Yeah, guys, let's control ourselves in the comments. Okay, remember why you're here, please, and make sure that you're able to get the most out of it, and make sure that all of your classmates are able to get the most out of it as well. You remember this is significant for you guys, so please act reasonably when you're in the comments. I don't mind if y'all blow it up, but remember where you are. Okay. So can you go into specifics between the difference between the extensive and intensive farming? Matthew, we're going to definitely look at that. In a nutshell, you look at intensive. It's going to be you've got farmers using regular, pretty ordinary tools, not a bunch of fuel-driven stuff. Maybe animal labor on a relatively small amount. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I was looking at subsistence and commercial there. I wasn't even thinking extensive. Large amount of land area, relatively small inputs in that land area. So you look at something like, here's an example. You look at nomads in Mongolia. All right, so they're wandering on a huge amount of land. Okay, they're not really putting a huge amount of time and energy into a small piece of land, but they're using it all, just kind of spreading themselves out on that huge piece of land. That's extensive farming. Intensive is going to be when you use that land to really use it for what it's worth. You're going to put a huge amount of time, energy, and resources into that land, and then you're going to produce very high yields on a relatively small amount of land. So if you look at rice farming, you're seeing very small plots of land with extremely high output or extremely high agricultural yields. As a commercial farming example, if you look at extensive farming, you're looking at something like wheat farming or ranching, cattle ranching. Again, uses a huge amount of land. You don't really have to put as much into it in the way of maintaining it or in the way of taking care of it as you would in something like a dairy farm, where the land is way smaller, but the amount of time, energy, resources, mechanization that goes into that kind of agriculture is going to produce really high yields, but it's done over a very small section of land. So those are really the differences between extensive and intensive in a nutshell. And we are going to look at some examples of that later on. Can you go over these theories? The ones that are about the world island, I guess, is what you're talking about. The hinterland, organic, and on and on. My goal is to get to that. I don't know if I got in here or not. All right, so all right, I'll go over in a nutshell. We might have to pull this into our bonus review later on. But if you look at the rimland theory, for example, the idea that you've got these well, you got the heartland and rimland theory, and they're kind of the same. This guy named Halford Mackinder comes up with this idea that if anyone was ever to control what he called the world island, or basically where Eurasia is today, then they would be able to control the resources on the outside of that. And if they were able to do that, they would essentially be able to control basically the world politically. And so, exactly, Caitlin. And so this started to, I think this theory kind of came to fruition in the very early 1900s, and no one really cared because the British had the most powerful navy, and the United States kind of was a burgeoning world power during after World War II. I'm sorry, World War I. But then after World War II, that's when you start to see there's simply going to be two superpowers at that time. It's going to be Russia and the United States. And Russia, as it happened to be, controlled the world island. And so people all of a sudden are like, oh my gosh, if we don't contain Russia and the communist threat, they're going to take over the world, because they started to encroach upon what we consider to be the rimland. Right. So the rimland theory is kind of like if one's light, one's dark, right? The rimland theory kind of says the opposite. If one can control the rimland, they can contain the power that controls the world island. So that was the basis on the containment policy during the Cold War, and the United States and their what do you call those, aircraft carriers and the Navy and the modern technology and all that kind of stuff are things that I guess end up proving the latter of the two. So in a nutshell, that's really what you're looking at with those. When you look at the organic theory, this is the idea that oh, I dropped my mic again. I keep doing that. Sorry. It's because my knee, I don't know if you guys know, I just had ACL reconstruction. So my knee is like super sore. I'm just trying to stretch it out here because it's sore. I keep dropping my mic. So the organic theory is going to be where Hitler, for example, or I guess you got people that would say if a country is not growing, it's dying, right? So a country has to grow in order to continue on. So Hitler used this as the basis for his conquest of the places that contained German people. So he would take over the Sudetenland. He eventually would take over Austria and Czechoslovakia and all these different places, because he was trying to get what he called Lebensraum, or living space, right, for his people. And so he applied the organic theory in that way. And that's really what the organic theory is. The idea that a country has continued to grow in order to survive. I just realized I never hit start answering on that. So if you're listening to it now, be sure to back that bad boy up a little bit and hear those. And I think that I've covered all three of them kind of in a nutshell. And we will get to them later on, either in this review or a later one, depending on where it is. Okay. Let's look. The extensive and intensive agriculture, where would shifting cultivation fit in? Remember the analogy I just gave you earlier. Shifting cultivation is going to be between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn, and it's going to happen. It is a tropical form of agriculture. It is associated with the idea that people are going to, or sometimes you see it called slash and burn. They cut down the natural vegetation, they burn it up. It creates potash in the form of ash on the ground. It will make the ground fertile for 3, 4, 5, maybe a few, maybe 6. I mean, but definitely usually about 3 to 5 years, and then they have to move on, because after you have 3 or 4 harvests, it completely depletes the nutrition out of the ground, and they have to go and cut down more land and make more territory. I guess make more farmland that way, and eventually they're going to kind of move on. As population grows, it becomes a little bit more unsustainable. So there is a great PBS NewsHour, what's it called? If you type in PBS NewsHour shifting cultivation, you will see a pretty cool little snippet. I can't remember what they called it. It was named after a book this guy read. But you'll see a snippet where they talk about sustainable ways of continuing on with shifting agriculture, but making it in a way that it's more sustainable. But anyway, yeah, that's where you would see that along the tropics. You see a lot of it in South America or Central America, a lot of it in Sub-Saharan Africa, and even in places like Indonesia. Anywhere there's going to be rainforest, you're going to see some of that. What would be good? What would be certain situations that is? Talked about this a little bit last week in Unit 1, But site and situation apply so much to every single unit we're looking at. When you think about site, by definition, you're looking at the characteristics or the things that that create a certain character within a certain location. You could say that New York City is busy. You could say that it's probably still cold there. I don't know. I'm not there. You could say that the traffic is crazy at rush hour, right? You can look at the buildings and be like, hey, these are the biggest buildings ever, or there's a cultural melting pot. These are all some of the characteristics that play into the site factors that help us to understand what New York City is when you're there. That would differ from places like where I live, in South Carolina. So I'm actually from Columbia. It's a way smaller city. Traffic is bad, but it's not like New York City bad. There's a lot of suburban towns like Lexington and Irmo on the outside of that, and so the site is going to be different. The weather patterns are going to be different. It never snows. Thank God it never snows. I don't have to show that junk, right? But sometimes it does ice over, and when it does, we can't drive. We got to go get our milk and bread. We got to get it quick, right? So those are examples of site factors. Situation is going to be where something is in relation to something else. And usually when we look at it from either a geopolitical or maybe an economic standpoint. The perfect example of this is there was one of my earlier presentations. I'm talking about a Starbucks plant, or I'm talking about FedEx, or wherever it might be. The places where these corporations locate factories or locate their processing plants or their distribution centers is no accident. They find the best place they can so they can have the cheapest labor, the most productivity, the best transportation networks, the best access to raw materials or whatever it is they might need. And that's where they locate their businesses on the basis of all these situation factors. So that's the difference. Site is like, what is a place like? Situation is, what is it near, or what is it close to? What other geographic features fit into the location that we could use from an economic or geopolitical advantage? So good question. Definitely something you guys need to know. Why does the United States feel threatened by China parading in the South China Sea? It really depends on your perspective here, but I'd say probably one of the biggest is there's a few that I'm gonna give you. Probably the biggest one that stands out to me is that there's a lot of manufacturing over in that area, not just China, but like Taiwan, Korea, all these different places that we buy goods and we also do trade with. So all this stuff moves usually on these giant shipping barges. They have these containers that you can fit a bunch of stuff in. So if you order something from China, it's going to go through the South China Sea via a shipping barge in a container. Well, if China has enough control that they start saying we're going to regulate what goes and what comes, that gives them power over us. Whether they use it or not, it gives them power over us, right? So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. Another thing too is that we have allies there, and we don't want them being walked all over by China is what we would consider maybe somewhat authoritarian ways. So, for example, Taiwan isn't really recognized as a sovereign nation, but we like them. We don't want to see them be absorbed again, really, by China and made to be like the other Chinese, because they are more like a republic. For example, those are just maybe a few of the examples that you could use. Perhaps some more other. I didn't hit the start answering button. Sorry about that. Why are maquiladoras so important in the United States? I already answered that. Looks like a few others have gone in there and answered them as well. I definitely covered that on an earlier video too, when we were talking about industrial and economic geography. Can you explain the bid-rent theory and the Von Thunen model tying together? How do they both correlate? Simply, when you talk, and this is definitely what I want to get to. I might not get to it today. When you talk about bid rent, you're looking at the cost of land, all right? And this is also going to apply to the urban models as well, like the concentric zone model and the sector model and all those. The land closer to the city center is going to be more expensive. All right, so the way that we act in regards to that land is going to be different too, especially from an economic standpoint. The Von Thunen theory is a commercial agriculture model of rural land use. So when you think about it, farmers are trying to maximize profits, and they're going to do that by locating strategically where they need to be relative to the market, and by minimizing transportation costs. And so when you think about bid rent, simply the further away you get from the city center, the less expensive the land is going to be, but the further it has to travel. So if you have something like wheat that doesn't spoil easy and isn't really super hard to carry because it doesn't break and it's not ridiculously heavy, you can locate that further away from the market and get the best bang for the buck. If you got something like milk that's going to spoil super fast and be hard to carry, you're going to want to put that as close to the market or in the market as you can. So you're going to spend more on the land, but you're going to spend less on the transportation and hopefully have a higher economic revenue from that. So hopefully that answered the question well. Where would transportation be located in the multiple nuclei model? The multiple nuclei model is going to occur in the time of cars. So you're not looking at a transportation mechanism like a train or like a rail cars in the same way that you would with a sector model, for example. It would be something that is going to be influenced by the fact that people can kind of drive wherever they need to be. So that's the reason why you can locate in places that might not make sense by the other two models. Okay, one more. Where did the religions Buddhism and Hinduism diffuse, and where are its hearts? Definitely have that. We're going to go over that on the bonus review, hopefully. But yes, Buddhism is going to start in what would be modern day Nepal, and what back then was one of the kingdoms in India, and diffused throughout India. But later on, Hinduism kind of rediffused in that area, and Buddhism is basically not anywhere in India. But you're going to see Buddhism in places like China. You're going to see Buddhism in Southeast Asia predominantly. You're going to see Buddhism as a syncretic religion blended with Shinto in Japan, and Sri Lanka, which is a little island just to the south of India, is also primarily Buddhist as well. So that's Buddhism. Hinduism is almost exclusively in India. So the vast majority of people that practice that ginormous religion of maybe about 1 billion strong, or just fewer than that, almost all of them live in India. So it hasn't diffused very far. I mean, I'm not saying you don't have friends that are Hindu, or people don't send their kids to universities in the United States. I mean, I just had a bunch of Indian friends or Sri Lankan friends or Southeast Asian friends. But I'm just saying the vast majority of Hindus live in India, overwhelmingly. One more. In what stage of the demographic transition model do people begin commercial farming? I remembered. Super important point. I'm glad you asked that question. But the demographic transition model is a model that shows demographic transitions. In other words, how population changes over time. It's literally what that means, right? Demography having to be the study of population, transitions being how something changes over time. And so that's the first thing. I think Shane mentioned that actually. But when you think about stage 2, the transition from the hunter-gatherers, or the people when the birth rates and death rates are both really, really high, the thing that changes that is really going to be the mechanization of agriculture and the Industrial Revolution that led to more food, more medicines, more materials that kept kids primarily alive. And so your question is, what stage does people begin commercial farming? I would say they began commercial farming in some form or fashion by stage 2 of the demographic transition. And you can see that today even. It looks different, but you have many of the specialty crops like coffee and cocoa, for example, that we love to consume, comes from these same regions that do slash and burn or subsistence farming. So you got people in those countries who are selling agricultural products they can consume to people who have the money to buy them. All right, so I'm doing pretty bad at hitting this little answer button. So anyway, okay, so let's take a break from that. Let's look over here at gerrymandering. All right, so 9 things that Michigan voters need to know about gerrymandering case. Oh, this is in the news right now. I mean, I literally pulled this on April the 27th is when it was written. So I guess I'll pull it after that. So it's pretty fresh. And here's what you're looking at in Michigan. So remember, gerrymandering is going to be when congressmen use their ability to draw congressional lines as a way to gain political power in their state, and they do it by in several different ways. Usually, either by absorbing a group of people, like a people that would vote one way into a larger group of people that might vote for, in this case, Republican, or they might split the Democrats in this case in a way that they can't have a numeric advantage. Or they might put all of the Democrats in one different area and draw lines around where those people are. So if you look at this, you're going to see, let's see, 2016 outcome. You've got 5 Democratic congressional districts and 9 Republican. If you look at the hypothetical nonpartisan congressional districts, then the outcome could be, as you can see, far more evenly distributed in terms of people being able to vote for their legislature and maybe even the party losing its place. So right now, this is in the Supreme. I'm sorry. This is in the courts being debated on whether or not they need to be more fair in terms of the way they draw lines. And you see this all the time, y'all. This is not just the only place it happens. It happens in other places like Maryland. Look how crazy that is. I mean, and it's supposed to be based on population. So you're looking at the idea that as many people are in this congressional district 4 as is in congressional district 5. Why they got to carve it up like this? I mean, it almost looks like they're trying to isolate a group of people from another group in order to make it so that 7 of these places will be Democrat and only 1 Republican. And then you look at South Carolina. And if you look at South Carolina, you can't notice the congressional lines and say that's not fair, because when you draw it out in South Carolina, it actually kind of looks fairish. Maybe the only one that would be questionable is District 1. But the reason why I'm showing you this is because in my state, here's a little bit more on Maryland. And by the way, both parties do this. It's not just a Democrat-Republican thing. I intentionally showed you an example of Democrats doing it and Republicans doing it. But look at this. In South Carolina, when you look at the poverty levels, notice that there was a correlation between the poorest people in my state and congressional district number 6. Wow. And then if you look here, there's a correlation between congressional district number 6 and poverty and the percent of people that are black. And so you start to see, my gosh, this is disenfranchisement. This is a form of oppression, you know? The people here, the schools don't have the same resources. The people don't have the same opportunities. You can actually draw a line around these different things and make that connection. So you could say that gerrymandering exists even when it's not so obvious on the map. And that there is the point that I'm trying to make here. Once again, looking at them all together. All right. So gerrymandering simplified. Essentially, this here is what they're trying to do. They're trying to make it in some way, shape, or form so that one group will have an unfair advantage over another. And notice that even though green has the majority, there are some different cases where you can make purple win, even though there's a majority of people that are green. And that's the point here. So gerrymandering is considered unfair and all that, but really it's hard to regulate and it's hard to keep people in power from doing it because I mean, you ever heard the saying, if you're not playing the game, you're not gonna win, right? As long as both sides are playing the game, no one wins when it comes to people getting their views heard by their legislators. And packing, cracking, stacking, all these different words. There was a gerrymandering FRQ a few years ago, and really every single one of these more or less were taken in some form or fashion. So I wouldn't say you need to spend so much time understanding the different versions of how gerrymandering works, but know what gerrymandering is and know the implications of it. So it's a way of parties keeping a power over others, and in a lot of ways, it prevents people from having their voices heard when voting on matters. Okay, I'm gonna skip that. I already talked about that. All right, so this brings us to federal and unitary states. Federal and unitary states. I want to talk a little bit about this because it's in the course description. There was an FRQ on this a few years ago, so it's very unlikely you're going to see an FRQ on it, but you will definitely see this in the form of multiple choice. So if you look at this, all political systems fall on a continuum from the most concentrated amount of power to the least. This here comes as a quote from the Ethel Wood book, and what I've done here is I've kind of shown a little bit of a chart that shows where these things would fall. So over here, you would have a unitary government. In the center, you would have maybe what we would consider federalism, which is not just one government over everyone, but you have a bunch of local governments as well that kind of share power with the federal government. And then over here, you've got a confederal system, which is where you've got a territory that may be loosely allied with one another, but really the local level governments call all the shots. All right, so this is kind of like what you would have seen if you looked at the Articles of Confederacy that made up the beginning of our government before our modern Constitution. And here this is blown up so you guys can see it better. These are all examples of unitary republics. So you have Rwanda, you have the United Kingdom, South Korea, North Korea. Usually these are pretty small countries that are going to be a part, they're going to look like this. But if you go over here and you're looking at bigger countries like Brazil, like Australia, like Russia, Canada, United States, these are all going to be federal systems because they have more territory, they have a more varied amount of people living there, different ethnic groups, whatever it might be, different nationalities. And so you're going to see more local level governments in larger geographic areas like these countries on the right. If you're looking for an exception to that rule, China is actually a large country, and I just covered it up, but China is a large country that is in fact a unitary state because that, I mean, obviously they're very authoritarian, they're very, very conservative, almost like a dictatorship. They want to control everything from the people's republic. They don't want to have local legislators make decisions that might benefit some groups differently than others. So that's more of a unitary example, even though it's a larger geographic area. Let's see. Federal states, powers divided constitutionally between the central government and the regional governments, right? Like you would see in the United States of America. We have, not only do we have the central government, we also have state governments, we also have local level governments as well, the city level. So each one of these different states have different responsibilities in terms of what they do on behalf of the people. Unitary states are going to be those where every single thing goes through the central government. Again, usually this is going to be easier to do if you're geographically in a smaller territory, like somewhere like France, for example. All right. Local governments are an extension of central government if they have them. Education, licenses, public health, safety, all these different things are handled by the central government, not by the state government like it would be in our case. So if you're going to get your license, you're going to go, the state is the one that handles that. Education is handled by states as well, things like that. The legalization of things like weed are handled by states. All right, so, and again, there's just more what I just now said, so I'm going to skip that for now. Y'all can look at that later. Unitary states are usually smaller, I just said that. Federal states are usually larger. Okay, so supranationalism. Moving on. Supranationalism is another sovereignty stopper, or another example of why sovereignty is hard to define. If you look at after World War II, we already mentioned that there was only going to be two world superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And we have nuclear bombs. We were going to win World War II with nuclear bombs, right? And after the fact, by about 1950, the Soviets had them as well. At this point, what we used to call balance of power no longer really exists. You've got the United States and their allies, and the Soviets and their allies. But before this, you used to see this system of alliances that would prevent one country from gaining so much power that they would have a huge political and military edge over other countries. Okay, so after World War II, but in response to the Cold War period between the United States and Russia, you start to see the emergence of various different supranational organizations. Now, before that, you had the League of Nations. I don't know if I'll put that in here or not. You had the League of Nations, which is going to be part of Winston Churchill's 14 points plan. It was designed to prevent war by putting all countries together in a way that they could work out their differences in means other than warfare. But obviously, the United States were like, no, we're not gonna do that. So Congress was like, no, we don't want to be allied with other countries and put in a position where we have to bend on our own rules to affect our own people. And so the League of Nations never really happened. But after World War II, you start to see this alliance between what was called the first world and the second world. And what the heck is the second world, right? Essentially, you're looking at NATO, which is going to be the blue here, and the Warsaw Pact countries, right? And the purpose here was, again, that policy of containment we already talked about. They were an alliance of countries against another alliance of countries. The leader here was the US, the leader here was the Soviet Union. Here's another diagram that shows the first, second, and third world. So usually when we talk about the third world, we're looking at it in terms of a development definition. We're saying that Africa is a third world because they're poor and they're undeveloped and they don't live a good lifestyle like we have here. But when you think about it, the first world were the US and their allies. The third world were those that were under the influence of either the US or the second world, which was headed up by the Soviets. So the third world were the places that we were trying to protect from communism and vice versa. And the places where you saw this the most were going to be in these areas along the rimland, right? These places that shared a border between capitalist countries and the communist countries, places like Vietnam, places like Korea, places like Afghanistan, right? And then maybe a few over here in the Americas as well. So that's the third world. So the third world doesn't mean undeveloped, even though today that's what it means. That's almost always how we refer to it. If you ever wondered where the second world was, it disappeared with the fall of the Soviet Union. But many would argue that Russia is trying to bring it back in some form or fashion. Efforts were made to contain Soviet expansion. By the way, I do think it's good to know a brief history of the Soviet War, the Cold War, because of the way it relates into other things we looked at, like the policy of Iron Curtain or containment or the Heartland and Rimland theories. It's hard to understand some of the geopolitical squabbles that exist today without understanding the history that led up to that. So I would definitely make sure that you know a little bit about the Cold War. These here are all going to be some of the biggest proxy wars that occurred during that period. So remember, it's a Cold War because the United States and the Soviets never hurled nuclear bombs at each other. Everybody knew that would be Armageddon, but it was still a hot war if you look at the level of these places here. So and yeah, there were some cases where we outright sent troops to places like Korea and Vietnam, but for the most part, we facilitated. It's telling me I got 30 more minutes. We facilitated proxy wars, much like we are doing right now with Syria. Oh, I just added a new session. I did not mean to do that. Let me because I'm not going past 9 today. So hopefully we're good there. Okay. There's NATO again. By the way, that stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Warsaw Pact is going to be the Soviets and their allies that were in Eastern Europe and part of Central Asia. Okay. By the way, once the Soviet Union fell apart, a lot of these Warsaw Pact countries became their own independent countries. Some of them still kind of ally more so with Russia. With Russia, some of them ally more with NATO. Ukraine is kind of a big example of that. All right. Let's see. I'm going to take a break, look at the questions real quick, and see what we can answer. How has Brexit affected not just the EU, but other supranational organizations? That is a really good question. And I think that the jury is still out on that. But one of the overwhelming fears from the get-go with the United Kingdom leaving is that I think I showed y'all this on a chart in an earlier presentation, but basically not all countries put in what some of the biggest countries do. Germany is going to put in more when they get out of their EU. The UK does as well. France does as well. So the bottom line here is with the Syrian migration crisis and also with some of the political problems in northern Africa, you have a huge amount of immigrants going into the United States, most of which are going to be Muslims, most of which are coming from countries that are not like Europeans. And so just like we have a problem today, Americans have a problem today with immigration. I'm just saying that's a first and foremost problem in the news right now. I'll guarantee you watch PBS News hours, going to be someone immigration and a wall and all this kind of stuff. The same problems going on in Europe. No matter how you feel about immigration, same things going on there. So part of the Brexit was centered on the idea of we want to be able to control who comes and who goes. With the European Union, that's one of the things that brings them together as an economic powerhouse, is that there is not very much regulation on who goes and who comes between countries. They have the same currency. All these things are built to make that this whole region a stronger economic region to do business with places like the United States. So when Great Britain backs out of the European Union, it's the first time that anyone ever did that, and it kind of opens the door for other richer countries to say, hey, you know what? The United Kingdom wasn't benefiting from this, and now, especially if they do better under their own, as an independent country, then you got places like France and Germany, big economic powerhouses within the EU, are going to start looking at this and saying, well, would we benefit from no longer being a part of the EU? So you might have other countries that might be a little bit more poor, like Spain or Greece, that might think about how they might benefit. So it could be almost like a domino effect. I mean, if it looks like the United Kingdom is going to come out of this on top, other countries may end up following suit. So that could kind of spell more of a shift away from supranationalism to independence and sovereignty, more of a conservative shift. So who knows what the future holds with that? We just have to look and see what happens with the United Kingdom, to be honest. That's history in the making. That said, you're not going to see a Brexit question as an FRQ. It's not in the course description, even though it might apply to a lot of the discussions we're looking at here. I just don't think you're going to see something that new. A lot of these questions were already written several years ago, and like I said, Brexit is happening right now. So you can look at the news and apply geographic concepts to that scenario, but I don't think you're going to see questions about Brexit on the AP exam. Can I talk in depth about disputes in the South China Sea? I don't know if there's a need to go too much deeper than what I did. I will say there are some really good videos on YouTube. In fact, I actually think I made one several years ago in there that might go into a little bit more detail. But the number one thing is, if you go back here and you look at the map you're just not looking at, it's China trying to impose themselves upon the sovereignty of other nations. So that's the key here. It has to do with the why and where. Okay, why are we looking at South China Sea? Because it plays into how we're studying politics right now. If a country should have sovereignty based on an internationally agreed upon set of laws on how we control water as territory, then China's kind of overstepping its boundary right now. And the question is, how are we going to address that? How are we going to enforce it? Okay, it puts into perspective. I guess it puts into question a lot of things we agree upon as an international community. So that's probably the main reason I would look at that right there. And I don't think it's important to know every country associated with it, or but think about it in terms of China exerting their power over other sovereign nations, and then tie that back into our overall discussion. It also has to do with economics. Like I said, if China controls that region, they control a huge chunk of the trade that flows between the whole entire region of Asia and the rest of the world. So these are definitely big deals here. Samantha Green says it's because the economic opportunity and gain that countries get from it. Yeah, that, and also the sovereignty portion that we just mentioned. Is the boundary between India and Pakistan superimposed? I'm going to say no. I don't think we consider that a superimposed boundary. And the reason is because the differences between Muslims and Hindus had already existed in that country, even prior to the British leaving. So in a way, the British were like, okay, so we've been here, we've colonized this place, we've exerted unbelievable influence over this area, and now it's time for us to leave. But nobody wanted them to leave. They didn't want to leave, and the Hindus and the Muslims definitely didn't want them to leave, and then them have to fight with one another. So Muslims, who were in the minority, were deathly afraid that the Hindus were going to establish a government that would be just as oppressive to them or more than the British were. And so as part of the agreement of the British leaving, they decided they were going to partition those two. And I think that they were agreed upon by the Muslims and the National Congress there. So I'm pretty sure that those two groups got together and agreed on those boundaries. And if you remember, they used to be just East and West Pakistan. Today, East Pakistan is now Bangladesh. They're both Muslim countries still, but that's why they came about. So I don't think I wouldn't consider that a superimposed boundary. That's a good question. Let's see. Is there a possibility of an FRQ on gerrymandering on the AP exam? There's always a possibility. I'm going to say no, though. And the reason is because it was only like maybe 3 or 4. I think it was 2016, 2015, 2016, something like that, where there was a gerrymandering question. So I really don't think you're going to see a gerrymandering question on the AP exam unless they pitch it in a completely different way and it has to do with maybe another overarching topic. You never know what you're going to see on the AP exam. That's all there is to it. But I could say you're not going to see an outright gerrymandering question on the AP exam because there was one recently. So that's how, I mean, I'm telling you, it would blow all of our human geography minds if they did something like that. Will there be a way I can access live stream after it's over? There were some key points, whatever, but I did not get it down because I did not write fast enough. Yes, Jasmine, if you have a 5 Plus account, which right now is I'm pretty sure today I got an email saying it was about $5 a month. I don't know if that's a promotion or if that's going to go on, but right now I would definitely check into that because that's a steal. I can tell you that is a steal. So if you have a 5 Plus account for $5, you can definitely go back and look at the older material for sure, and I think that would be very, very advantageous. Again, you don't want to go back and try to watch everything I've ever said because I don't think there's that much time. But you should hopefully know where you're strong and where you're weak. If you're strong in population, don't spend a lot of time studying population. Just don't do it. Spend time studying agriculture if you're weaker on that topic. What are your predictions for this year's FRQ? Friend, I think that the central place theory is a good one that you might see because you've never had that, and I think it's very doable. I personally think that the Millennial Development Goals are something that I could see them putting on the AP exam. There was plenty of people that say, no, that's not going to happen because they expired in 2015, but they were replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals, which are like a continuation of that same concept. We're trying to create sustainable development and sustainable ways of moving forward. So I could definitely see where they might do that. I would never rule it out. I actually made my own MDG, SDG FRQ for my students for that very purpose because I think that would be a good one. So those are the two that I would like to see on the AP exam. Difference between balkanization and balkanized. We're about to get to that. Actually, I'm going to we're going to go and look at it right now so we can get to it now. All right. So supranationalism, I discussed that earlier as well if you guys want to go back. Very quickly. We're going to do a little bit of skipping around because we're running out of time. Centripetal and centrifugal forces built, we should have probably talked about this with nationalism. In science, when you talk about a centripetal force, it's like if you take your lanyard. I don't know if you guys have lanyards or not where your ID badges are on, but a centripetal force is going to be the force that prevents your lanyard, your ID badge, from flying away whenever you are spinning your lanyard around. Okay, so it's a force that holds something together, more or less, scientifically and sociologically or nationally. So it's strong leadership, external threats, education, that's good, ideology. All these things are going to be stuff that could bring a group of people together as one. So and it's like that on a large scale as well as on a small scale, right? So if you're in a school with crappy leadership and you have a terrible principal and bad administrators and your teachers hate their jobs, then I wouldn't say that the school is going to be very productive in teaching people because a lot of that kind of is centered on relationships and on feelings of being safe and on feelings of knowing that people believe in you and all that kind of stuff. So if you have a school that has strong leadership, great teachers that form relationships and all these different things, those are centripetal forces. The opposite of that is going to be a centrifugal force, which is going to be ethnic or cultural differences, religious differences, linguistic diversity, all these different things, economic disparity. Some of these things we have in our country, right? There's a lot of racial tension. There's a lot of religious and cultural tension. There's a lot of economic disparity right now. These are things that are in the news. I don't think there are things that are going to cause us to have revolutions and people revolting and things like that. And that happens in other countries where these things are more heightened. But those are examples of centripetal and centrifugal forces, for sure. Examples of this could be seen in places like Spain. And you look at a map of Spain. I think I've got one here actually. If I don't, then that's weird. I don't. All right. So, but Spain has several different places where the people are linguistically or ethnically different. And two of the ones that I would say stand out the most is going to be the Basque country, where they speak a language called Euskera, which is in no way related to any Indo-European language. It predates Indo-European in Europe. It's the only European language left that does that. And then you've got this Catalonia, or a Catalan. I should say Catalan. No, it should say Catalonia. I'm sorry. These are places in Spain that have different groups of people that have different linguistic and cultural characteristics. People that speak Catalan don't speak Spanish. It is a dialect of Spanish. Some people even call it its own language. Okay, it's a Romance language, but it's not the same as Spanish. Well, both of these places have their own parliaments. They have their own language and official status and control over education and taxation. They essentially have autonomy, but they're not independent countries, right? So this is an example of what we call devolution. Devolution is when a country maybe gives up a little bit of power to other people on a local level. A good example of devolution would be maybe the United Kingdom giving local legislative powers to the various kingdoms that make up the United Kingdom, like Wales and England and Scotland and Northern Ireland. So let's see. Oh, hang on, I'm going. Oh, okay, I'm not. So other examples of devolution would be Belgium. You guys surely learned about this in AP Human Geography. The people up north are going to be Dutch and they speak Flemish. People in the south are going to be called Walloons and they speak French. If you look at a map of Belgium and its situation in Europe, the Walloons share a border with France. The Flemish share a border with Belgium. I'm sorry, with Denmark. And so there's a lot of devolution there because they don't really have a powerful central government. Almost all the shots are called like separate countries. So Flanders is going to do its own thing. Wallonia is going to do its own thing. And even the German-speaking people that share a border with Germany on the eastern side, they're going to kind of do their own thing as well. And the weird thing about this is the capital of Belgium, Brussels, is bilingual. And they still kind of stick to themselves even there. So it's a very, very weird situation. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of these ethnic conflicts. There's no way I'm going to get through it all in 15 minutes. So I'm only going to probably honestly look at maybe two of them. And one of the ones I'm going to look at is going to be this one right here. This one here is Yugoslavia. All right. Now, here's the thing: is that Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore because of the process of Balkanization. Now, this is the Balkan Peninsula, the Balkans. Sometimes you hear the whole region called the Balkans. And this is basically where ancient Greece is going to be. So you got Greece down here, Macedonia, and then the former Yugoslavia states in the region known as the Balkans. Well, the reason why the word Balkanization means the breakdown of different ethnic groups into different individual countries that usually is associated with violence and all kinds of ethnic and political tension is due to this region consistently being a powder keg in Europe. It was a problem between a Serbian nationalist and the Austrian king that resulted in, or I guess the Austrian Archduke that resulted in World War I. So I'm talking, this isn't even something that's new. But the Balkans, I guess Yugoslavia came under the power of a man named Joseph Tito, all right, in 1945, I believe. He was a communist. He was not part of the Warsaw Pact. So he's an independent communist leader that really was able to maintain stability in this region, even despite the ethnic differences that you can see. Tremendous ethnic diversity in this region. But remember, communism promotes equality, not nationality. It is not the same as something like fascism. So everyone was a worker. They weren't allowed to be identified by their ethnic differences. And so for the most part, Yugoslavia was kept mostly in check due to that process. But when Tito died in 1980, they didn't have a good backup plan for keeping that ball rolling. And so you start to see where local groups started trying to take power in Serbia. I'm sorry, in Yugoslavia. And one of those groups was Serbia. They're the ones that are shown in pink here. They have a very large population of people in Yugoslavia. And the leader that rises up to the occasion here is a guy named Slobodan Milosevic. And he becomes kind of a hero, and he has this rhetoric that's centered on Serbian nationalism. And so just like Hitler with his Lebensraum, Milosevic starts to try to create what he called a greater Serbia by taking over areas in other regions of Yugoslavia where there was a lot of Serbs. So anyway, all these, you can see the boundaries here. This here is the boundary between Serbia and, say, Bosnia and Herzegovina. But there's a lot of Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So what did Milosevic do? Well, he supported rebellions by Serbs in that area because he wanted to bring it under control of Serbia. So you start to see this ginormous regional war go on, and it was super complicated. Basically, what's happening is Serbs are fighting Bosnians. Croatians are also fighting Bosnians. Bosnians are getting killed all over the place, but there was atrocities on both sides. Slovenia declares its own independence. Macedonia declares its own independence. Kosovo over here is made up of what we call Kosovar Albanians. Look at Albania down here. These dudes are ethnic Albanians. They're not Serbs, but they were part of Serbia. So all of these people are in the mix, and they're fighting because of their ethnic and religious differences. Serbians are going to be Orthodox Christians, all right? Bosnians were Muslim. And so there was a difference there as well. So it was a religious, ethnic, linguistic differences, all the differences combined made up the problem there. So eventually, the West is going to have to get involved here because you've got talks of ethnic cleansing. In other words, the Bosnians were being moved and exterminated and removed from their territory, and that's some pretty terrible stuff. And so in 1994, Croatia was coerced to stop war with Bosnia. In 1995, NATO got involved as a supranational organization that put a stop to the fight between Serb rebels and Bosnia. Okay, so you had the Dayton Accords, which included our President Clinton at the time, who kind of helped to mediate the problems between the different people here and establish some degree of peace between Serbia, Bosnia, and Croatia. And but then in the late 1990s, you see the problem again emerge with Kosovo. And so Slobodan Milosevic goes in and starts again trying to ethnically cleanse out that region of the Kosovar Albanians. NATO gets involved again, kind of a repeat of the things that happened a few years prior to. And then NATO occupies Kosovo, and Russia's like, oh my gosh, you can't do that because, I mean, Serbia is a sovereign country, and you guys are going to try to bring about the independence of Kosovo through this process. And surely enough, in 2008, whenever NATO left, Kosovo did hold a referendum to become their own country. And that is not recognized by most countries in the world because, again, a group of people can't just decide they're going to not be a part of a country anymore without the recognition of the United Nations. And since Russia is part of the UN Security Council, they are never going to recognize that. And so Kosovo is not recognized by the United Nations as a sovereign country, even though sometimes you'll see it as one, and for example, on this map. All right, so that's where the word balkanize comes from. Balkanization is the process by which a state breaks down through its conflicts, and that's kind of the story of balkanization. It's not the only place where balkanization happens, but it definitely is the reason why the word means what it means. Now, the other one that I want to talk about today for sure is Sudan. All right, and this is one that is still in the news today because South Sudan, as you can see here, is the newest country on earth, but they're still extremely ethnically and religiously diverse. And so over here, it's pretty easy to see that the majority of people living in the northern part of the country they're Arabic Muslims. All right. Over here in the Darfur region, you start to see a lot more ethnic diversity, and in South Africa, more ethnic diversity. So these guys are all Arabic Muslims. Over here, you've got Black Africans that are going to be a mix of all kinds of different ethnic groups and religions. Like some of them are Animists, some of them are Christian. Same thing for these groups down here. So they're not united ethnically, but they are united in the fact that they don't want to be controlled by an Arabic government that benefits mainly the people in Khartoum or the people that are in the northern part of the country. So this brought about a long civil war that raged on from at least 1980 all the way up until the early 2000s, before South Sudan almost unanimously broke away from Sudan as a country. And then everyone's like, wow, this is a huge moment. Many of these Sudanese refugees that moved into the United States, we call them the Lost Boys, many of them moved back because they want to be a part of the new government. And then within a couple of years, all that broke down, and South Sudan is now in the middle of a dirty civil war, a nasty civil war, because they can't agree on who's going to lead because of all the ethnic diversity that exists there. So here's a kind of a breakdown of what happened and what I just now said. Sudan is super ethnically diverse. You got mostly Arabic Muslims making up the government and the northern part of the country, but South Sudan was mainly Black Christians and animists. And the West, you had a few tribes. And this here is where you're going to see your Darfur region. Essentially, what's happening with Darfur is there was this group of individuals known as the Janjaweed that were hired by the government to essentially kill off the Black Africans living in Darfur region, or black Muslims, Africans living in Darfur, that weren't the same as the Arabics that were living there. And so it was basically genocide, all right? And that's the thing that you hear about in the news a lot, or that was really big in the news in the early 2000s. And you still hear about it even today sometimes. There are still refugees all over the world that left the country during this time as well. And it was almost all centered on economics. For example, there's a lot of oil in Sudan. The oil is mainly in South Sudan, but it is brought through Sudan in order to get to the Red Sea. And so by the time it left here and got to here, the Sudanese were the ones who were reaping all the benefits, and South Sudan didn't get any of that. And so that was kind of the problem there. All right, let's see how far we can get. We just talked about that. Okay, another one I wanted to mention, just because we have a little bit of time here, and we're not going to get to agriculture today. We're going to have to do that on one of our bonus rehearsals. We're going to have a few more minutes. But Rwanda is another example here that I think we need to look at of some of these ethnic problems. And this here is one of the nastiest ethnic cleansing genocides that have occurred in modern times. I mean, it's gross because of the way it went about. Basically, Rwanda is a pretty small country. There it is right there. But there are these two different ethnic groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis. And these two different groups, even though culturally there's very little difference between the two, they were defined differently by imperialists during the time they were occupied by the British. And so the Hutus make up the majority, but the Tutsis seem to be the ones who are in control. During there was a time where there was an election, and the Tutsis were overturned by a Hutu president that came to power and then was subsequently shot out of the sky. Because of that, Hutus thought the Tutsis had done it and used them as a scapegoat, and basically called for the complete destruction of the Tutsi people. And so you've got all these individuals who get together with literally machetes and clubs and torches and walk around throughout their villages, killing their neighbors and killing people that were in their family or their extended family or their best friends because they were Tutsis. It was just a very, very nasty, in-your-face kind of genocide that resulted in as many as 800,000 people being murdered in a matter of a few days by individuals setting buildings on fire with a bunch of men or machetes. I mean, it's almost like sometimes you can go on YouTube if you want to and hear some of the accounts of these individuals who were a part of this systematic murder, and it'll blow your mind how they describe. Like this one person I heard said the devil came over him, like he just was stuck in a sick fervor where he just had to kill people. Others say that they did feared that they would be killed if they didn't. Just a bunch of sick stuff like that. So all right, and that does wrap up all that I have in terms of political geography. By the way, the reason why I put this here is because from a cultural and political standpoint, this is a geographic transition zone, but it is also quite literally a cultural, and ethno-linguistic, and religious transition zone as well. So when you talk about the African transition zone, I want you guys to associate with both the physical geography as well as the cultural geography. But what we're going to do on Sunday, if you guys can join me, is we're going to talk about we're going to look back and hit migration, because I didn't get to that last week, and we're going to get to as much of culture as we possibly can. We may not get through it all. I'll try my very best. And then what we're going to do next week is I am going to start with Unit 6 and Unit 7. I'm going to try to, probably what I'm going to have to do is hit another bonus for her review and look at agriculture separately. And so I'm going to try my best to get through it all. We're going 2 hours trying to hit it all to get you guys ready for AP exam. I want you to be as ready as possible. Know that all this stuff has been covered in, frankly, a lot more detail in the earlier review. So if you are a 500+ member, you can go back and start reviewing the places where you know you're weakest. They're organized by topic. So feel free to do that and kind of get an edge and help yourself prepare. Don't forget, I modeled an FRQ at the end of February, on February 28th. So if you think that would be helpful, go back and watch that. And let me know what I can do. Samantha, you got a question? Let's take a look at it real quick. I'll end on some questions. I only got a few minutes. Let me see if I can find Samantha's question. Samantha, can you type it there for me real quick? Oh, there it is. Could you give the exact definition of gerrymandering? Yes, gerrymandering was created by was named after a representative named Jerry. And what happened was the lines were drawn so askew and so weirdly that as a comic, one of the people, like a political cartoon, as part of a political cartoon, they drew a salamander around it. Okay, and it looks like this. All right, so they call it a gerrymander. That's where the name comes from. And so it simply, the definition is to draw congressional lines in a way that is unfair towards whoever it is that they're representing. So Republicans use it as a way of getting a political edge over Democrats. You also see where Democrats use it to get a political edge over Republicans as well. So it goes both ways. With that said, I got 10 seconds, y'all, and I'm going to go ahead and sign off today. I appreciate you guys' time, and hey, feel free to write your